The girl was born screaming under the late summer sun, wet and ruddy, her cries slicing the heat-heavy air like a blade. She was the third child and the first daughter. No one cheered. Mari's bled too long after the birthing. The midwife, a half-blind woman named Etta who smelled of fennel and smoke, packed her with moss and whispered prayers. Her hands moved quick and hard, like she wanted the whole thing over with. When it was done, the child was laid beside her, slick and squalling, and Mari's turned her head toward the wall. "She's healthy," Etta said, brushing the child's matted scalp. "Strong lungs." Mari's nodded once. The wall didn't blink. Outside the cabin, the sounds of livestock, cicadas, and men's boots filtered in. Rurik came in after sundown. He didn't ask after her pain or the blood. He didn't touch the girl. He looked down at the infant like she was a failed crop and spat into the hearth. "I needed a son," he said. "You promised me one." Mari's didn't answer. Her breath still came short and shallow. She had named the girl in her head, Anouise, but said nothing aloud. He stepped to the side of the bed and pressed a palm to her thigh, just above the damp, crusted edge of the birthing cloth. "Maybe you're no good anymore." She turned her face further to the wall. The next morning, Mari's woke to an empty cabin and the child gone. Panic surged in her throat, hot and dry, but then she heard the soft mule. Etta had come back and taken the girl to wash her by the creek. "She's got your eyes," Etta said as she returned, swaddled bundle in arms. "But her mouth's her father's, poor thing." Mari's reached for the child and held her close, burying her nose in the sweet animal scent. She bit her tongue so she wouldn't cry. That night Rurik came back drunk. He stood at the foot of the bed with a bottle in his hand and fury in his shadow. Mari saw the shape of it cross the wall behind him. When he moved, it moved, larger than life. "What do you call her?" he asked. Mari's hesitated. "Anouise." He frowned. "Sounds like a whore's name." He lifted the bottle and drank. The sound of his throat swallowing made Mari's flinch. Then he swung the bottle without warning. It hit the side of her bedstead, inches from her leg. Anouise startled awake in her arms, wailed. Rurik left without another word. That was the last night he touched her bed. Weeks passed. The land outside their homestead baked to dust. The well dipped lower. Chickens died. Rurik's temper sharpened with the air. When Anouise cried at night, Mari's wrapped cloth around her mouth and held her against her breastbone, whispering lullabies with no melody, just sound to keep the baby quiet. Her own body still ached in the deep places from the birth. She bled on and off. Etta said it wasn't right, but what could she do? Then came the morning of the branding. It was supposed to be a livestock culling, just 2 men and a fire. But Rurik had brought the neighbors, men from 4 miles off, Brougham, Tilk, and the scout, Ellis. They came on horses, drinking, guns visible at their hips, watching Mari's as she carried out a jug of water. "She moves slow now," Tilk said, "like something broke in her." "Maybe something did," Rurik laughed. "She gave me a daughter. That's the worst kind of rot." The men laughed. Ellis didn't. He was a lean figure with eyes that didn't wander. A scout for the Southern Trail, rarely seen except when he needed supplies. He didn't laugh at Rurik's joke. He drank slow and wiped his mouth after each sip, watching Mari's but not leering, not like the others. Mari's caught his eye once. He nodded. She didn't nod back. That afternoon, when the cattle were done and the men drunk, Rurik called her out again. "Come here, Mari's. Show them the whore who birthed dead weight." She didn't move. He grabbed her by the arm and dragged her forward, child and all. The baby cried. Mari's stumbled. Her dress tore. He ripped the back of her collar and shoved her to the dirt. "Maybe she needs a mark, too." Tilk and Brougham laughed. Ellis stood up. "That's enough." "What's it to you, Scout?" Rurik barked. "She's mine." "She's not cattle." Rurik's hand hovered over his belt knife. "She's less." Then Annalise cried again, a hard, high wail. Maurice covered her with her body. Rurik moved like he might strike her with his boot, but Ellis stepped in, hand on his pistol now. I said enough. The air grew still. Rurik stared at him, blinking slow. Then slowly he lowered his boot and spat in the dust again. Get off my land. Ellis didn't move. Maurice looked up from the dirt, blood trickling from her lip. She didn't speak. She just watched. Later, when the sun sank and the drunk men rode off, Rurik didn't come back inside. He slept in the barn, drunk and muttering. Maurice washed herself in cold water with the baby in a sling against her chest, her skin bruised where he'd gripped her, her pride worse. The next evening, Ellis returned. She was hauling water from the well with a split lip and stiff arms. He came on foot. I'm not here to take anything, he said. She didn't answer. I saw what he did. She kept walking. I won't come again if you tell me not to. That stopped her. She turned. Her eyes were hollow with sleep debt and quiet fury. What do you want? He glanced at the child on her hip. To help. Maurice laughed once, bitter and small. Then you're a fool. He didn't argue. You'll be run off or shot. Maybe. She stepped closer, eyes narrowing. Or maybe you want something I haven't figured yet. Ellis didn't smile. I want nothing from you. He paused, then handed her a wrapped bundle. Inside was a soft cloth, some dried meat, and a small flask of tonic. For the bleeding, he said. She didn't thank him, but she took it. That night, Rurik came home and didn't notice the extra cloth or the better meat stew. He smelled of spoiled beer and bitterness. He climbed into the barn again and muttered to ghosts. Maurice didn't sleep. She lay in the dark beside Annalise, the scent of Ellis's medicine on her fingers, and stared at the roof beam. A slow thought moved through her. He hadn't taken her hand, but he'd offered it. And that made all the difference. The wind turned colder before the trees did. The air came through the chinks in the wall like a warning. Maurice stuffed moss and old cloth into the worst of them, working with one arm while the other held Annalise close in her shawl. The girl had begun to track her with those dark eyes, watching each movement like she knew things no one told her. Rurik stayed gone longer now, sometimes for days. When he came back, he brought nothing but mud and the stink of defeat. Once he returned with blood on his knuckles and refused to say whose it was. He looked at Annalise like she'd cost him everything. He looked at Maurice like she owed him the balance. When he slept, he did so with a knife tucked under the straw mat beside him. He had begun to mutter names in his sleep, her name and others she didn't recognize. He said them like curses. She built new habits. She carved thin wedges of wood for the windows. She learned how to silence the baby's cries with pressure instead of song. She trained her ears to hear the difference between a rabbit's scratch and a man's boot. Most nights she didn't sleep. Instead, she rocked Annalise by the hearthlight and listened to the old boards creak when the wind changed. Ellis came back with the first frost. She found him at the edge of the field, just past the hickory posts, watching the cabin with stillness like an animal unsure of a trap. You said you wouldn't come again, she said. He nodded. You didn't tell me not to. She narrowed her eyes. And what do you want now? To see if he's buried you yet. She let that hang in the cold air between them. Then quietly, not yet. He stepped closer. There was a cut healing across his cheekbone. His boots were caked in black clay. He looked worse than before. But he held out a sack with 3 apples, a flint, and 2 pieces of cured meat. For the girl, he said. Maurice looked down at the bundle. Her body ached from the weight of the child. Her hands cracked from cold and work. She took the sack. Her fingers brushed his. You still a scout. I walk the trail, I listen. Some folks still pay for that. What do you know? That your man been asking around south of the ridge, asking what a daughter's worth to the right kind of buyer. Maurice felt the marrow drain from her. She stepped back, held Anois tighter. He wouldn't. Alice didn't speak. She turned her face to the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney. She thought of Rurik's hands, how they'd held a newborn and a blade the same way, rough and without care. What do I do? She asked. Ellis paused. You run. She laughed, sharp, joyless. With a babe in arms, across open field and frozen creek, he'd find me in a day. Not if you're not alone. You'd help. I've helped worse, he said. I've seen worse. That night she packed without sound. 2 wraps for the child, a tin of dried roots, a small knife. She moved through the cabin like a memory. Rurik was gone again. His boots hadn't been at the door. His rifle hadn't been above the hearth. She left a note scrawled in soot across the barn wall. Rot in the house you built. Ellis waited where the trail dipped down into the wooded gulch. He had a mule now, gray and stubborn, with eyes that had seen too much. He gave no greeting, just nodded and held out a hand to help her mount. She ignored it, swung herself up with Anois bound to her chest, and they rode without speaking. 3 days they moved north. She nursed Anois behind trees, always listening. Ellis took her across the backways, never the open road. They camped behind brambles, beneath fallen rock faces, under branches so thick the stars barely showed. He lit no fires. At night, Maurice watched the dark for Rurik's shape, imagined his boots crunching frost behind them. But it never came, only owls and the wind. By the 5th day, Anois had begun to laugh, just small, strange sounds like wind chimes. Ellis turned to look once and gave the barest twitch of a smile. She's not afraid, he said. Not yet, Maurice replied. They reached a trade post half-ruined by last winter's floods. A single man kept watch over the yard, a former slave with 1 leg and a shotgun who took them in without question. Maurice offered the knife from her bundle in trade. He refused it. You need it more than me, he said. She saw herself in the cracked mirror behind the man's stove. Hollow-cheeked, smudged with ash and road dust, a tangle of hair and grief, but her eyes had grown harder, like flint struck too often. That night Ellis sat by the window, rifle across his lap. He said nothing until the moon had climbed high. You ever kill anyone? He asked. She shook her head. Would you? If he came for her, she said, I'd slit his throat with my teeth. Ellis nodded. Then good. She didn't ask if he meant it. A week passed, then 2. The snow began to fall, thin at first, then thick. They remained at the post, helping with wood chopping and repairs. Maurice learned to use the rifle when the old man let her. Her aim was steady. Her hands didn't shake. Ellis kept watch. On the 3rd week, a rider came. Not Rurik, but someone sent by him. A man with pale eyes and a heavy coat, asking about a woman with a child and a scar on her jaw. He said she stole from him, the man explained. Ran with his daughter. Maurice was hidden under the floorboards when he came in. Ellis sat with his coat over his knees and lied like it was breath. Don't know anyone like that, he said. Try west. The rider left with suspicion in his eyes and a promise to return. That night, Maurice looked Ellis in the eye for the first time since they left. He won't stop. No, Ellis said. Then we make him. He didn't argue. Winter deepened. Maurice cut her hair to the jawline. She learned to fight with a hatchet. She trained herself to wake at the softest creak. Anois grew teeth and laughed like she didn't know what she was born into. Ellis drew a map in the dirt with a stick. He'll be waiting in spring. When the pass thaws, he'll expect you to try to run west. I'm not running anymore. No, he said, you're not. Her eyes met his. I want the land, she said, and I want him gone from it. Ellis didn't smile, but his voice warmed just enough to hold the weight of what she'd become. Then you'll need to bury him deep. The thaw came like a slow bleeding, first in the sound of water trickling beneath the ice, then in the sagging of snow-laden branches, the sudden soft in the morning soil. By mid-March, the trails wept mud, and bootprints held shape for only a moment before the earth swallowed them whole. It was time. Maris had waited with her body coiled like wire. She wore her silence like armor. Each morning she rose before light, binding enemies to her back, moving through drills Ellis had taught her. Knife work, balance, listening for movement beyond her own heartbeat. She no longer flinched at gunshots, no longer bled each moon. Something in her had closed up and sealed hard. She carved her name into the grip of her hatchet. Not Maris, not the name he used. She carved mire from the earth she had clawed herself out of, from the wet and the rot and the rebirth. They left the outpost before sunrise, traveling light. Ellis had scouted the trail ahead, knew where the streams had swelled and which ridges were crumbling. He didn't speak unless she asked him, and she rarely did. Their understanding didn't need words now. Anais rode in the sling, older now, quiet when she needed to be, curious when she was allowed. Her eyes missed nothing. When a crow passed overhead, she watched it until it vanished. When Ellis handed Maris a flask, the child leaned forward like she knew what was inside mattered more than what it seemed. They reached the edge of Rurik's land in 8 days. It looked the same and not the same. The roof sagged on one end. The well had been dug deeper, its new stones darker and misaligned. Smoke curled thin from the chimney. The barn still stood. And a man still lived inside. Ellis kept low, watching from the pines with a spyglass. He's alone, he said, but not idle. There's traps, look there, wires on the fence, and that, by the door, he's rigged a snare to the bell. He expects a thief, Maris murmured. No, he expects you. She stayed crouched, staring at the place where Anais had been born, the dirt that had soaked her blood, the floor where Rurik had spit beside her name. I'm not going to steal the land, she said. Ellis looked at her. I'm going to make him give it up. They came at dusk. Maris approached alone, empty-handed, hands visible. Anais stayed back with Ellis, beyond the tree line. No wind, no birds, only the slow creak of Maris' boots on brittle grass. Rurik stepped out when she was 10 paces from the house. He hadn't changed much, beard longer, gut thicker. But his eyes still held that sneer, like the world owed him something he hadn't taken yet. Well, he said, look what the bitch dragged back. She didn't flinch. I came for the girl's claim. He laughed too loud. You'll have to be clearer, darlin'. Ain't no claim worth spit from a bastard daughter. She was born on this land. I was married to you when she came. That makes her a blood heir under Northern homestead law. Only if I'm dead. Maris didn't answer. She let silence stretch. Then I came to settle that. Rurik's smile faded. He stepped down from the porch, slow. So the little wren grew claws. She watched his hands. He wasn't carrying a rifle, but there was a knife at his belt and something mean behind his shoulder. You think you scare me, he said. You think walking back here changes what you were. No, she said. I think walking away made me something you never saw. He lunged without warning. Maris ducked right, pulled the hatchet from under her coat. The blade caught his shoulder. He howled, swung his knife wide. She stepped inside the arc and drove her knee into his gut. He hit the ground, gasping. She stood over him. He spat blood, laughing again. You won't do it. You're still the same whimpering sow who cried when I touched her. She said nothing. Then Rurik rolled fast, grabbing for her ankle. Ellis's rifle cracked from the tree line. The bullet tore through Rurik's thigh. He screamed, rage turning to raw fear. He clutched the wound, writhing in the dust. Not dead, Maurice called out. Ellis lowered the rifle. She knelt beside Rurik, his blood soaked into the dirt, just as hers once had. She reached into her coat and pulled the deed papers. Old, folded, signed in Rurik's drunk scrawl back when he'd bought the place cheap with borrowed coin. Sign it over, she said. He shook his head, teeth bared. She leaned close. Then I'll leave you here to bleed, and when you're half dead, I'll let the dogs come. You'll die screaming into the same dust you broke me on. He signed. When it was done, she took the paper, rolled it tight, sealed it with a strip of hide. Rurik passed out in the dirt, blood pumping slow. She looked at him one last time. Don't follow us, she said. Then she walked away. They burned the cabin that night. Not the land, just the walls that had held too many ghosts. Ellis poured oil along the foundation. Maurice lit the flame. They watched it blaze while Anneliese slept strapped to her back. She didn't cry. Maurice watched the fire climb high, licking the black sky, and thought of every night she'd laid awake in that house, planning survival, planning revenge. She thought of the night she gave birth with no one but silence beside her, of the weight of being seen not as a woman but as a womb. Ellis said nothing. When the last beam cracked and fell, she turned away. They built a home on the far end of the land, past the ridge where Rurik never walked, where the soil was thick with clay and the trees grew tall. It took a month. Maurice laid the foundation herself. Ellis taught her how to bind the rafters. Anneliese watched from a blanket in the grass, gnawing on a pine twig. The land became hers in time, legally, blood bought and claimed. But ownership meant little to her. It was something else that mattered more, that when she walked the border of it, no one stood in her way. That Anneliese would grow up knowing her mother had not fled, but returned and won. Ellis stayed, though he never said why. He built a linta beside the main house. He never asked to share a roof. One night, near the end of the second planting, Maurice stood at the field's edge, watching the moon rise. Her hands were calloused, her back strong again. Anneliese was too now, walking in crooked lines, laughing like birdsong. Ellis approached, slow. You ever think about what could have been? He asked. She didn't look at him, sometimes. And I think I was meant to bury a man, she said, and plant a new world in the hole. He nodded. They stood without speaking for a long while. When Anneliese ran into her mother's legs, covered in dirt and joy, Maurice picked her up and held her high. The girl laughed, full and loud, not afraid of anything. Maurice smiled. Not like the girl she'd been, but like the woman she'd made herself into, one step, one scar, one choice at a time. Summer hardened the soil and brought new hands to the edge of Maurice's land, men with tools and stories. Women in wagons, wrapped in scarves, eyes narrow from too many suns and not enough shade. Word had spread. There was land east of the pines where a woman had laid claim with a child on her hip and a dead man's deed in her name. They came to ask how she'd done it. She never gave them more than what they could see. She showed them the rows of beans, the straight walls, the creek she dammed just enough to feed the well. She pointed out where not to build, how to spot sinkholes masked in meadow. But she didn't speak of the night Ellis shot Rurik through the leg or the black shape of fire against a sky too wide to contain grief. That was hers. The child grew into the land like she'd been carved from it. Annie spoke early and walked far. She trailed after Ellis with her questions, pulled carrots before they were ripe just to see how they changed. She carved birds from driftwood with a knife dull enough to be safe and sharp enough to make her mother frown. She asked once if she had a father. Maurice didn't lie, but she didn't tell everything. He was a man who didn't know how to build, she said, only how to take. Anouilh thought for a long time. Then you took back. I took what was always mine. And that was enough. Trouble came again, as it always does. A judge from the county road in mid-harvest. Broad man, red-faced, wearing wealth like armor. He brought papers with official stamps and a mouth full of polite threats. There's dispute over this border, he said, pointing to the northern line. A claim from the Brasher family says this land was never rightly yours, says the deed was signed under duress. Mari stared at him from her porch, sweat on her brow, blade in hand from shelling corn. She didn't rise. No one claimed it for 5 years, she said. That's not the law. No, she said, it's just what's right. The judge folded his papers slow. You'll need to come to town, make your case. I won't leave the land. Then they'll bring men here. Ellis stood in the doorway. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. The judge saw him, nodded, and rode off. Maurice didn't sleep that night. She walked the land's edge again, barefoot, feeling the pulse of it through her soles. She buried the papers beneath the ash tree, not out of fear but out of habit. She sharpened her tools, fed her daughter early. Then she waited. The Brasher men came on the 3rd morning, 4 of them mounted and armed. One carried a flag, the kind militia wore to make it seem official. They dismounted without greeting. Their leader had a toothpick in his mouth and eyes that smiled without humor. Mari's Reich. She said nothing. You're occupying unlawful territory. We've come to escort you to a hearing. No. Then we'll remove you. She didn't move from the porch. Ellis stepped out from the side of the house, rifle slung. The man with the toothpick smirked. Scout, didn't figure you for housebit duty. I'm no one's pet, Ellis said, but I don't like men who lie about their claims. This ain't about you. No, Mari said, it's about me and my daughter. The men stepped forward. Mari's raised her voice. Your boots cross that step, you forfeit the right to walk away. Something in her tone made the youngest of them hesitate. Ellis cocked the rifle. The man with the toothpick spat and turned his head. You ain't worth the trouble, he muttered. Not yet. They left. But not far. The standoff lasted 7 days. No court came, no orders, just the men circling the land like vultures waiting for death. Maurice didn't leave the house. Anouilh stayed close, quiet, eyes bright. Ellis laid traps, taught Maurice how to trigger and reset them. They moved together without speaking, like partners in a war neither of them named. On the 7th night, they came. 2 of the Brasher men slipped through the back field. Low, fast, thinking they were clever. The first met a bear trap. The second met Maurice. She moved fast, knife low, silent. He grabbed her wrist, stronger than she expected, but she didn't panic. She let her weight drop, used his balance against him. They hit the dirt. She cut his cheek. He screamed. Ellis fired once into the air. They fled. At dawn, she went into town. She wore no dress, only boots, belt, and blade. Anouilh stayed with Ellis. The sky was low and gray, ready to split. The town's clerk was a thin man with too much ink on his fingers. He paled when she walked in. I'm here about the Brasher claim, she said. He stammered, nodded, found the file. She read it herself. It was thin, full of assumptions, the kind of claim made not for truth but pressure, a threat, not a right. She handed it back. Then she lined in close. "If you file it again," she said, "I'll send back the hand that signs it." She walked out. The judge never returned. The season turned, leaves fell, men stopped testing her lines. A small school was built near the ridge. 3 families pooled tools. Mary's helped raise the walls. When Annalise took her first lesson, she carried a book Mary's had carved a nameplate into, her own name, not her father's. The homestead grew. Chickens, then goats, a second well, a neighbor built a smithy. One night Mari sat outside with Ellis, a fire burning low between them. He sipped from a flask, passed it to her. "You still waiting for the next fight?" he asked. "I don't wait," she said. "I prepare." He nodded. "You ever think you'd end up here?" she asked him. "No," he said, "but I like it more than I deserve." They sat quiet for a long time. Then Ellis reached out, hesitant, like a man stepping toward a cliff, and set his hand beside hers. Not on, just beside. She didn't move. But she didn't pull away. Annalise turned 5 that spring. She planted her own seeds. She caught her first fish. She started writing her name in the dirt, carving it with a stick. She didn't know what it meant to be born from fire, but she knew she was loved, and watched, and safe. And Mari's. She stood taller now. She laughed sometimes, soft and low. She still kept the hatchet near the door, but her hands were less clenched, her voice less sharp. She had not forgotten. But she had built something bigger than the memory. The 7th year passed with storms. Lightning cracked trees in half. Floods carved new scars into the earth. One night the wind pulled a shed from its moorings and threw it 50 feet across the field, but the house held. The roots they had sunk ran deeper now, wood hardened with oil, stones packed tight, fences mended after each blow. Annalise stood in the doorway during the worst of it, arms crossed, watching the sky with calm eyes. Mari's told her to come inside. The child only said, "It won't take us." Not fear, just fact. Mari's nodded and opened the door wider. They lit no candles that night, only sat by the hearth and waited for the storm to spend itself. Ellis slept near the back, one hand on the rifle, the other curled beneath his coat. He didn't wake once. They all knew by then, some things don't reach you when you've already walked through fire. By morning, the creek had swallowed the lower trail. The back pasture drowned under 6 inches of brown water, but the house stood. The fields bent but didn't break, and the trees kept standing, even the ones that looked dead. Mari's walked the perimeter. Mud pulled at her boots. She watched the water retreat and said nothing. But she remembered another flood, years back, when she'd sat shaking with a newborn in her arms and wondered if she'd live long enough to teach the child how to dig. She lived longer than that. The sheriff came just after the thaw. Not to threaten, not this time. He came quiet, without a badge on his chest, wearing sorrow like a weight across his shoulders. "Trouble in the valley," he said. "Bandits running folk off their claims, killing some, stealing the rest." Mari's didn't ask what he wanted. The sheriff looked at her porch, heard what you did with the Brashers, heard you held the line. She didn't answer. He cleared his throat. "We could use people like that." Mari's shook her head. "I don't leave my land." The sheriff looked over his shoulder. Annalise stood near the fence, taller now, bow in hand, hair tied with a strip of hide. He nodded once. "Maybe she will." Then he rode off. They buried Ellis that fall. It was a small death, not a violent one. He went still in the chair beneath the porch roof, eyes half-lidded, the sun touching his boots. Maurice found him with one hand curled around a cup, the other loose at his side. No struggle, just stillness. She didn't cry. She dug the grave herself, near the north line where the stone is soft. Annalise placed a carved bird on top. They said no words. He had never asked for any. Later, she found a box he'd left buried under his cot. Inside, a map, a knife she didn't recognize, a photograph faded near white, and a letter. She read it once, then burned it. The fire took it clean. Years passed. Annalise grew straight and strong. She didn't ask about her father anymore. She stopped fearing blood. She learned to track by scent. She learned to lie when it served her, and to tell the truth when it cut sharper. Once a man from the rail camp called her a squatter's bastard. She broke his nose. She came home with blood on her sleeves and a story behind her teeth. Maurice didn't scold her. She made her clean the blade slower next time. They walked the fields each spring and talked of expansion. Annalise wanted to build a kiln. Maurice wanted to plant fruit trees. Neither rushed the other. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and played at silence. It was their oldest language. On Annalise's 10th birthday, Maurice gave her the deed. Wrapped in cloth, sealed in wax, the old signature still visible. "I don't need it," Annalise said. "It's not for need," Maurice replied. "It's for proof." Annalise tilted her head. "Proof of what?" "That no one gave you this. You come from it. It was paid for in blood and time and silence. No one can unmake what we built." Annalise looked at her long, then took the deed and tucked it into her satchel. That night they didn't speak, but Maurice watched her sleep and knew the land would hold. Not because of paper, but because it had been made by hand, by sweat, by teeth bared in defiance. The last time Maurice saw Rurik was a year before her hair went gray. She was in town trading tobacco and thread when she spotted him across the square, older, limping, one eye clouded. He didn't see her. Or if he did, he didn't recognize what she had become. A woman with her own carriage, her own land, her daughter walking tall beside her. He shuffled past like a shadow. Maurice didn't follow. He wasn't hers to bury anymore. That night she told Annalise what he looked like. The girl didn't blink. "If he comes back." "He won't," Maurice said. "He has nothing left to take." Annalise nodded. "Then we let him rot." Maurice smiled, only the second time she had smiled that year. She died in the fields. Sun warm, hands dirty. Annalise found her curled beside the roots of the oldest tree, the one that never bore fruit but held firm through every storm. She didn't weep. She buried her mother where she fell, placed a ring of stone, carved no name. There was no need. Everyone in the county knew who'd built the place, whose blood it was bought in. What kind of woman had planted justice like corn and reaped peace like wheat? Annalise didn't leave the land. She expanded it. She taught others how to hold what was theirs. She trained women in the use of steel and silence. And when the next round of men came claiming deeds over bodies, she met them at the fence with a hatchet her mother had once swung into a man's shoulder. They turned back. Years later, children would ask where the house came from, where the trees had come from, where the land ended. Annalise would point to the horizon and say, "It ends where my mother stopped walking." They would ask who she was. And Annalise would say she was left to blade for birthing a girl, and then she built a kingdom from the wound.